Okay, so welcome back for another deep dive. I love a good mystery.
Hmm.
And this one, well, it's a doozy.
Yeah.
We're diving into The Adam and Eve Story by Chan Thomas.
Yeah.
This book, it's from 1965. And get this, the CIA was super interested in it.
Really?
Yeah, so we've got excerpts from a declassified CIA document,
Yes.
a diagram of the Earth's cross-section,
Whoa.
and even some old transmittal slips. They list things like C-cells and fender repair kits.
Interesting. So it's like what was this a random assortment of? What's going on now?
It's a total hodgepodge, right? It's intriguing to say the least.
It certainly is. And to think the CIA was digging through all this,
Oh.
it really makes you wonder what they were looking for.
Exactly.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
what caught their eye. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's lay out the basics of Thomas's theory. He's suggesting that Earth's history is basically a cycle of, and I'm not exaggerating here, cataclysmic events.
Cataclysmic. So we're talking major upheavals, not just
Yeah.
not just minor shifts.
Oh, no. He's talking about like the planet getting a serious makeover. He believes these events are what shapes Earth, like geographically speaking, and they're not pretty.
When you say cataclysmic, can you give us an idea of the scale? What are we actually talking about here?
Well, he's talking about rapid shifts in the Earth's poles. I mean, imagine the North and South poles basically switching places.
Wow.
That's the scale of change he's suggesting.
So not subtle changes.
Not at all. And to give you an example, he points to the Laurentian Basin ice cap. It used to be in Canada, and it vanished, just like that, around 11,500 years ago.
And this lines up with any other major events 11,500 years ago.
Well, that's the thing. It's around the same time as this massive global sea level rise.
How much are we talking?
Try 200 feet.
200. Wow. So
No.
so coastal regions gone.
Gone, exactly.
Yeah.
It's hard to even fathom that much change.
It's like hitting the reset button on the planet.
Yeah, basically. And he uses the coral reef at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean as
Yeah.
evidence of this.
That makes sense. Coral and ice water don't exactly go together. It does make you wonder what those corals saw.
Right. What happened to turn a tropical paradise into the Arctic we know today?
And this is where it gets really wild.
Oh, yeah. This is where Thomas takes a sharp turn into, well, unconventional territory.
How so?
So he connects these cataclysmic cycles to the biblical story of Adam and Eve,
He's saying Adam and Eve as in the Garden of Eden.
the one and only.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but how does he
Yeah.
make that connection?
So he claims that the Adam and Eve story, it's not meant to be taken literally.
Yeah.
He believes it's an allegory encoded in ancient Naga glyphs.
Naga glyphs. Now, those are not something you come across every day. What are they exactly?
They're basically these ancient symbols. And according to Thomas, they hold the real story of the last cataclysm.
So like a hidden history passed down through symbols.
Exactly.
And where do these glyphs come from? Who created them?
That's part of the mystery. Thomas believes they were created by a long-lost civilization.
Okay, so we've got ancient symbols, a lost civilization, and a cataclysmic event that reshaped the planet. This is starting to sound like a lost Indiana Jones movie.
Right. And Thomas is basically saying he's cracked the code.
Okay, so what's his interpretation? What's the Naga version of the Adam and Eve story?
So according to Thomas, Adam and Eve, they weren't the first humans.
Okay.
They were descendants of this really advanced civilization. And get this. This civilization, they lived on a mother continent. That's what he calls it.
A mother continent, so not just a garden, a whole continent.
A whole continent. And he equates that to the Garden of Eden.
Wow. Okay. So how does the fall of man fit into all of this?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Hmm.
In Thomas's view, the fall, it doesn't represent sin or disobedience or any of that.
Okay.
It represents the destruction of this advanced civilization.
Yeah.
Like their whole way of life was wiped out by this cataclysm.
And Adam and Eve were witnesses to this destruction.
Exactly. They're survivors. They represent the few who managed to escape and adapt to this radically changed world.
I'm starting to see where he's going with this. But it's a radical reinterpretation, to say the least.
Absolutely. He even interprets that flaming sword guarding the Garden of Eden, as a symbol for, you won't believe this, the Earth's molten layer, like breaking through during the cataclysm.
So not just a flood, but fire, too.
Fire, floods, earthquakes, the whole shebang.
Yeah.
He doesn't hold back on the destruction.
It's a pretty terrifying picture he paints.
Oh, yeah, it's intense. But to be fair to Thomas, he doesn't just pull this out of thin air. He does try to back it up with evidence. He pulls from all sorts of fields, geology, paleontology, you name it.
What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, he brings up the Beresovka mammoth. It's this mammoth that was found frozen solid in Siberia.
Right, I've heard of that. What about it?
So here's the thing. It had fresh buttercups in its mouth.
Still fresh after all that time.
Yeah, which suggests it froze incredibly quickly, like almost instantly.
Wow, that's a pretty compelling detail. It does make you wonder what could cause that kind of sudden freeze.
Right. And then there's Tiahuanaco. It's this prehistoric city in the Andes Mountains.
I've never heard of it.
It's really fascinating
Yeah.
because all signs of work there just stopped. It's like everyone just vanished mid-task.
Spooky, like a civilization frozen in time.
Exactly. And he's got other examples, too. He talks about legends of these massive floods from cultures all over the world.
Oh, like a universal flood myth.
Exactly. He even brings up the Piri Reis map. Have you heard of that one?
Vaguely. It's a really old map, right?
Yeah, it's from the 16th century, but it seems to show Antarctica. And this is the crazy part, in pretty accurate detail, centuries before it was officially discovered.
That is strange.
Yeah, so Thomas believes this map. And these flood myths, they're like echoes of knowledge passed down from survivors of previous cataclysms.
Okay, so let's say for a moment that these cataclysms are real. These massive pole shifts. What's causing them?
Right, it's not like someone just bumped the Earth off its axis.
Although that's a terrifying thought.
Right. But Thomas has an answer. It's a bit out there. He says it's the Earth's core, specifically what he calls atomic explosions in those molten layers.
Atomic explosions, as in nuclear.
That's what he's suggesting. He describes the Earth's core like a motor generator.
A motor generator, and these explosions, they disrupt the whole system.
That's his theory. They mess with the Earth's magnetic field, its electrical structure, and that's what causes the poles to go haywire.
So it's not external forces like sunspots or anything. It's coming from within the Earth itself.
That's right. It's like the planet having a really bad stomach ache.
Except instead of indigestion, it's global catastrophe.
Pretty much. But here's the thing. Thomas doesn't see this as a one-time event. He's convinced these cataclysms happen in cycles.
So they're inevitable.
In his view, yes. And he uses the story of Noah's Ark as another example.
Another biblical parallel. He's really drawing connections there.
He is. He's basically saying, look, this has happened before, it'll happen again, and we need to be prepared.
That's a pretty sobering thought.
It is. He even predicts that the next cataclysm, it's going to be as bad as the one that wiped out the Laurentian ice sheet.
200-foot sea level rise, mass extinctions. The whole 9 yards.
Yep. The whole shebang.
Which brings us back to the CIA. Why were they so interested in a book about ancient cataclysms? What did they make of all of this?
Right. It's the million-dollar question. Did they take it seriously? Did they think Thomas was onto something? Or did they just file it away as, interesting but ultimately harmless speculation?
We may never know for sure, but the fact that they were even looking at this is, well, it's pretty telling.
It is. It's like a giant question mark hanging over this whole deep dive.
And then there are those transmittal slips, hole saw sets, C cells, fender repair. It's like, why are these everyday things mixed up with this theory about planetary upheaval?
It's like finding a grocery list tucked into a lost Shakespeare play. Totally bizarre.
Right. It makes you wonder if those slips were part of something bigger. Like maybe the CIA was preparing for something. Or maybe they were responding to something Thomas had uncovered.
Okay, now we're going full conspiracy theory. But I have to admit it's an intriguing thought.
It is. It's like, what were they thinking? What did they know?
The CIA and its secrets.
Right.
But before we really go down that rabbit hole, let's bring it back to the cataclysm itself. Thomas, he doesn't just talk about it in general terms. He actually describes it in excruciating detail.
What do you mean excruciating? Like, how bad is it?
Think the worst natural disaster you can imagine.
Okay. Hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis.
All at once.
Yeah.
And then multiply it by, 1,000.
Okay. Now I'm starting to get nervous. Give us the rundown. How does it all go down according to Thomas?
So he describes this earthquake. It's unlike any earthquake we experience today. It's deep. It's primal. And at first it's almost silent.
Silent? How is that even possible?
Well, he describes it as this low rumble that gradually builds until it's shaking the very core of the planet.
Okay, I can sort of picture that.
And then imagine the Pacific Ocean, just drawing back, like it's taking a deep breath.
Oh no, that is not a good sign.
Not good at all, because then it unleashes this wall of water. He says it's over 2 miles high, just crashing down on the land.
2 miles? That's taller than most mountains.
Taller than Everest. And it's moving with the force of 1,000 freight trains?
I'm guessing?
Yeah.
Not many people survive that wave.
He says it wipes out entire cities in seconds. Los Angeles, San Francisco, gone.
Just gone, wiped off the map.
Exactly. And if that's not bad enough, then you've got the wind. He's talking 1,000-mile-per-hour winds.
1,000. That's That's insane.
Yeah, it's like a hurricane from hell. He says it tears across the land, shredding everything in its path. Buildings, trees, even the ground itself.
So it's not even safe to be inland.
Nowhere is safe.
Yeah.
And then, to make matters worse, the Earth's molten layer, it starts breaking through the surface.
Like volcanoes erupting everywhere.
Everywhere. Imagine rivers of fire spewing out of the ground. It's like something out of a nightmare.
It's beyond a nightmare. It's like the planet itself is coming apart at the seams.
Exactly. And it's not just the Pacific. He describes the Atlantic Ocean turning into this raging monster.
Driven by those crazy winds.
Yeah, and the mountains, the Alps, the Pyrenees, even the Scandinavian mountains, they're all shaken to their core.
It's like the Earth is having a temper tantrum.
That's a good way to put it. And then he has this really eerie image. He describes the sun appearing to stand still in the sky for almost half a day.
The sun standing still? That must have been terrifying.
Yeah, like time itself has stopped working.
So with all of this happening, the floods, the fires, the earthquakes, what happens to people? Does anyone survive?
Thomas does mention pockets of survival, but it's not pretty. He talks about a few souls in western Siberia managing to ride it out.
Just a handful of people left in a world that's completely unrecognizable.
Exactly. It makes you realize how fragile civilization really is. It's like starting over from scratch.
Right.
After the apocalypse, what happens next? How does the planet even begin to recover from something like that?
Thomas describes it as a period of intense, like a reshuffling of the Earth as we know it. He says the oceans and winds, they're still in chaos mode for about 6 days. But then, on the 7th day, things start to calm down.
So after a week of utter chaos, the Earth gets a day of rest.
You could say that the waters recede, the winds die down, and the Earth, well, it's exhausted, but it's also changed. And that's when the rebuilding starts.
Okay, so what does the world actually look like at this point? I mean, is it totally alien?
It's familiar, but different. Like, imagine taking a jigsaw puzzle, shaking it all up, and the pieces fall back into place, but in a totally new pattern.
Okay, so like continents have moved,
True.
climates are different.
Exactly. He talks about the Earth's crust. It's been cracked and fractured, but now it starts to knit itself back together.
And what about the ice caps?
Well, they've been dislodged, so they start to, like, drift towards where the new poles are.
And the old ice caps, what happens to them?
They start to melt. Thomas specifically mentions the Laurentian ice sheet. Since it's no longer up at the pole, it basically disappears.
And the water from the melting ice, where does it go?
It contributes to reshaping the continents. He says the Indian Ocean actually ends up covering what we now call the Arctic.
Wow, that's wild. So the Arctic is now tropical.
For a while, yeah. But then new ice caps start to form.
So it's like a seesaw effect. The old ice melts, new ice forms.
Exactly. And get this. He says Greenland and Antarctica, they're now these tropical paradises covered in plants and animals.
No way, Antarctica is a tropical paradise.
That's what Thomas suggests. But
But
eventually they too become encased in ice.
Wow, it's like the Earth is playing musical chairs with its continents and climates.
At Australia, it pops up as this new, mostly unexplored continent up in the North Temperate Zone.
Okay, but what about like the places we know and love today? What happens to them?
Some of them are gone. Completely. Thomas says San Francisco and Los Angeles, they're buried under miles of mud.
No more Hollywood.
Not in this new world. And the Mediterranean Sea, it's a dry basin now.
Wow. So this cataclysm, it's not just wiping the slate clean. It's like it's completely rearranging everything.
Exactly. It's a whole new world. And Egypt, he says it gets lifted up higher by the shifting earth, so now it's this land of ancient ruins.
It's both fascinating and terrifying to think about how much our planet has changed over millions of years.
And how much it could still change.
Right. And that brings us back to the Adam and Eve story. How does Thomas connect all of this back to the Bible?
He's suggesting that those ancient Naga glyphs, they hold a record of this cataclysm, and that the Adam and Eve story is an allegory for what happened.
So when we read about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, we're really reading about this lost civilization and their experience of the cataclysm.
That's Thomas's interpretation. He even says that Eve was actually Adam's daughter.
Really?
Yeah, and that Adam was a widower. He's really going against the grain here.
He's definitely not afraid of a little controversy.
Not at all. But he claims that these details, they were twisted over time, through translations and interpretations.
So what he's saying is that the Bible we know today, it's not necessarily a literal account of history.
More like a game of telephone, where the story changes a little bit with each retelling.
And that makes you wonder, what other truths might be hidden within ancient myths and stories?
Exactly. And it makes you think about the power of those stories, how they can preserve knowledge, even across thousands of years.
It's like a message in a bottle from a long-lost civilization.
And what's the message? What's Thomas trying to tell us?
I think he's trying to warn us.
Yeah.
He sees these cataclysmic cycles as inevitable.
And he's saying we need to be prepared.
Exactly. He's not saying we should live in fear, but we need to learn from the past. We need to understand that the Earth has its own rhythms, its own cycles. And sometimes those cycles, well, they're not pretty.
It's a humbling thought to realize that we're not in control as much as we like to think we are.
Definitely. And it makes you think about those transmittal slips, the sprinklers, the fender repair kits. Were they just a coincidence? Or was the CIA, like, getting ready for something?
It's a mystery, and maybe we'll never know the answer. But it's a good reminder that sometimes the most interesting truths are the ones that remain hidden.
Well, on that note, I think we've done our due diligence for today's deep dive. We've covered ancient cataclysms, secret societies, government conspiracies.
We've even managed to throw in a biblical apocalypse for good measure.
It's all in a day's work.
Yeah.
Right. But seriously, this deep dive, it's really made me think about our place in the world and the forces that shape our lives. Forces that we may not even fully understand.
It's a humbling thought and maybe a little bit frightening, but it's also a reminder that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep an open mind, because you never know what you might discover.
That's the beauty of a deep dive. You never know where it might lead.